Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for another one of Jay Bazzinotti's virtual tours of Boston. I'm April Cushing. I'm one of the adult services librarians at the Norwood Library, and I know several of you were able to attend at least one of Jay's presentations on Hidden Gems of Boston. Tonight, Jay is going to tell us about some of the free or nearly free things to do in the Boston area. This is going to be the first one of 3 presentations, so stay tuned for more information about those. I see we have a great turnout tonight because who doesn't love a bargain? Welcome back, Jay. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. My name is Jay Bazzinotti. I am an amateur tour guide and I am a Revolutionary War reenactor with the 1st New Hampshire Regiment out of Nashua, New Hampshire. As you can see, I'm wearing my uniform tonight. And we were the first New Hampshire was the first regiment to become part of the United States Army in Medford, Massachusetts. And it was the last unit to be drummed out of the Army when Washington released the Army after the Revolutionary War in Boston, Massachusetts. So I've lived in the Boston area my entire life, and I've been giving amateur tours for many years and decades. And I decided to put together a little presentation because I love Boston so much. When I first started doing this, the library was kind enough to let me put on a presentation. Of course, it was before COVID, so in those days, it was an actual live presentation. I thought that I would be up there for 15 minutes then doing hand puppets, but now the thing is expanded into 6 or 7 parts, over 500 slides, and it really has grown larger than I expected. The presentation tonight, I hope, will be an hour or less. We'll end less than an hour, and then if there are questions, please feel free to ask. The focus of tonight's presentation are free things around Boston. So I always start these presentations with cool things from around Boston, historical things that came from the Boston area. Boston was the site of the oldest fortified area in America, North America. 1632 was Fort Independence. Of course, it wasn't called Fort Independence back then. There's been a fort there since 1632, and it's changed over the years to what you see now from the sky. It's a star-shaped fort. Castle Island was a castle until an island until 1928, when that whole area, which is the car import area from overseas, was filled in with dirt and made Pleasure Bay and made the island into a peninsula. This was the British headquarters during the Revolutionary War, and this is where the British would flee when bad things were happening into Boston. When the British sailed out on evacuation day, there was a major gun battle between Dorchester Heights and this fort, and the British naval forces, where over 40,000 rounds were fired. We always hear about the Battle of Bunker Hill, but we never ever hear about that big naval gunfight as the British pulled out. Boston was the site of the first licensed bar in America, 1634. The first brewery in America was in Jamestown, and the first tavern was in Manhattan, but it was just a speakeasy. It didn't last long. Well, it lasted 20 years, but it wasn't a licensed establishment. So the official licensed bar in Boston was called Three Mariners. It is on Washington Street, which is where downtown Crossing is now. And the reason that area was chosen was because it was near the Great Spring, which was part of an earlier presentation that I did. Water Street and Spring Street are the sites of the Great Spring, which is why Boston was founded. They needed the water to make beer. The first public park in America was the Boston Common, 1634. This was established as a grazing place, but it was also a slaughter yard. It was a pretty nasty place back in those days, pretty messy. And there was laws on the books that all the houses that were built around the common had to have doors wide enough for cows to pass through on their way to the pastures. The hanging tree was there until 1876, and many, many people were hung there, including George Webster, the man who killed George Parkman, John Webster, the man who killed George Parkman, of which this monument in the center is dedicated, as well as Mary Dyer, who was a religious person who was hung there. Boston Common was the home of William Blackston. He was the founder of Boston, in 1630. He bought the property so he could get away from the Pilgrims and the Puritans that had lived in Charlestown, because he was a nudist and he liked to walk around naked. So he went to Boston Common to get away from everybody. But in Charlestown, there was no fresh water to make beer. So the Puritans came to William Blackstone and they offered to buy the land from him. And then when they did, they kicked him out because they didn't like him walking around naked anymore. The first college in America was formed here in 1630. This says 1638 because that was when Harvard was formed. Back in those days, Cambridge was called Newtown, and the college was Newtown Theological College back in those days. John Harvard, who never went to the school, donated 780 pounds and 369 books. And that was more money than the entire budget of Massachusetts at the time. None of the original buildings remain, although if you go there, they have markers where the foundations were. The oldest building that's there now is from 1742. And all of the books that he donated were burned in a fire, except for one, which was illegally withdrawn so somebody could read it and it was saved. And they still actually have it there. The statue that's in Harvard Yard, it was made by Daniel Chester French. Daniel Chester French also made the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he made the doors for the Boston Public Library. He was a great sculptor. This is called the Statue of Three Lies because the inscription says, here sits John Harvard, founder of Harvard College, 1636. Well, it's not him because they never had a picture of him, so they got a model. And Harvard wasn't founded in 1636. And it wasn't Harvard then. Now, if you look at the shoe, you can see it's polished because for years, people have been told that it's good luck to rub his shoe when you walk by. This is a prank that's done by seniors who want tourists to rub the shoe, and they've rubbed it raw there, as you can see, because on graduation day, the seniors go up and pee on John Harvard's foot. So Harvard was one of the first 4 Ivy League schools, and they were called Ivy League schools because they were the ones that determined the rules of football. Ivy stands for 4, not for the ivy that grows up the sides of the buildings. First coffee house in America. So coffee came to Europe around 800 from Constantinople, and it eventually moved to America about the same time it was becoming popular in England. And it turns out that coffee only became popular in America because of the Boston Tea Party. When the revolution came, people couldn't get tea anymore and they had to have their caffeine. So they switched to coffee. And the first coffee house was in the mid-1600s. It was served at a public house, which is also a tavern. But this place, which was called the Green Dragon on Union Street, which is in Dock Square. Dock Square is still there. It's the oldest neighborhood in Boston. And the Green Dragon is still there, but it's not the same building. I think somebody just wanted to attach that name to it to get the cachet. So women were not allowed. They put on all kinds of shows and things in there while people drank their coffee. And cool thing about Boston. This, I think, is really hilarious. The off-the-rack suit was invented in Boston in 1822 by John Simmons. And you know John Simmons from Simmons College. He came to Boston to help his brother be a tailor in 1816. And they started this store. And they realized as they were making clothes for men that all the clothes, the sizes were generally common. So what he did was he hired women to work in their homes because women were not usually allowed to work outside of the house. So they would make standard sizes over and over again in their house and assemble them into suits, and he would sell them off the rack. This actually changed the lives of many women in Boston. By 1866, Simmons was the largest clothing manufacturer in the United States. And when he died in 1870, he donated his money to start Simmons College, which is still in Boston. Now, this is really cool. This is one of my favorite things about Boston, is Mount Auburn Cemetery. Mount Auburn Cemetery is actually just outside of Harvard Square, but I'm going to include it here because it's so close and it's so cool. It was opened in 1831, and at that time in Europe, there was a new movement that was happening. I don't know if you've ever thought about the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. A graveyard in those days was considered a somber place, and a graveyard always has a church associated with it. A cemetery may have a chapel, but it doesn't have a church or a parish associated with it. People were starting to get tired of the idea of the somberness of death, so a cemetery was more like a sleeping place. And they started making them into parks instead of these row after row of stones. Mount Auburn Cemetery, it's 170 acres of trees, gardens, and monuments to the dead. There are so many amazing monuments. I really think that people should go here and see this. It's an excellent place to go. However, if you take the tour, it's very expensive. So it won't be on my presentation here, free things to do in Boston, although we will see it a little bit later for something else. The oldest machine tool factory in America that's still running was started in Fitchburg. It's the Simmons factory. They started out making chisels and grinding tools. Then they went out and started buying up all the bankrupt manufacturers in America. And there's still a massive manufacturing presence in the United States, but they really don't make as many tools as they used to. Now they make engineered wood and prefab homes and things like that. I lived right next door to this plant when I was in college, and it was pretty nasty, let me tell you. First women's college in America, 1837. Bradford Academy, who started in 1834 as co-ed, but became all women in 1837, just outside of Haverhill, Massachusetts. It operated until 1999, when falling admissions and lack of interest caused it to close. Eventually, it was abandoned, and it was bought by Hobby Lobby in 2006. This one building that you see is just one of many. It's a very large campus. And now it's a religious Pentecostal college called North Point Bible Academy. So, still there though. So now today we have UPS and Federal Express, but they owe their beginnings to this one man, Thomas Hardin, who started the first express package company in America. He found out that he could ship packages very quickly by railroad, and he expanded to the entire world after the Civil War. He brought up a lot of different companies that delivered packages, and he helped started the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was a famous policing agency in a time before there were many police in America that would go around, and one of the things they did was protect the Wells Fargo and the overland stages throughout the Midwest. This was consolidated with all kinds of other express agencies during World War I, when the railroads were all being consolidated as well. It was made into an equity fund, and they no longer deliver packages. They're the largest shareholder of American Express. And our friend Hardin is buried in Mount Auburn, which I talked about, and this is his grave, which is very lavish, and he has a statue of his dog on one side, and on the other side, which we don't see, is a statue of a man delivering a package that has wings. The first department store in America in 1841 was Jordan Marsh. It was developed by Eben Jordan. He started out as an importer of wholesale goods, and then he started letting people come in and buy retail. This was the first store in America that was lit by incandescent light, made by Thomas Edison. In fact, he wired the store himself. Obviously, it's not the building in the picture, but that was not the first electric light in America. In England, Humphrey Davy invented the arc light in 1820. So people started to light things up with arc lights before Thomas Edison, but arc lights were not very good. Jordan Marsh, Eben Jordan, invented credit accounts, money-back guarantees, and he put in the internal glass showcases that we're so familiar with today. He also started the Boston Globe, which was started as an advertising rag, like a penny saver, so that he could promote his store. Jordan Marsh closed in 1996, and it was a definite tragedy for everyone who loved shopping. The first police force in America, which I've talked about in other presentations, was the Boston Police Department, which was started in 1838. So we also got the first detective department and the first detectives in America in 1846. The first detectives were formed in Paris in 1820, and they were separated from their police departments, and they worked as consultants, not as part of the police. By the mid-1800s, we had we had runners, Bow Street runners in England that were acting as police, until eventually a man named Sir Robert Peel developed the actual concept by which we consider police today. And Boston started its police about 10 years after England started their police, based on the same principles. We had the first detective. His name was Erastus Clapp. He was a very zealous detective and a truant officer who was rarely off the job. He captured thousands and thousands of people, and he was both loved and hated because he was such a diligent and mean person. Detectives were originally called detectors and not detectives. Here's something that I think is really pretty amazing. We think about the battle in the Civil War between the Monitor and the Merrimack, the battle of the first two ironclads. Well, the Confederate ironclad was the Merrimack, was made here in Boston in the Charlestown Navy Yard. It was considered the most modern ship in the Navy when it was captured by the Confederates. It was sunk trying to run from Norfolk Navy Yard, and the Confederates raised it, plated it over, renamed it the Virginia, and then it went out to start wreaking havoc with the Union blockade. So we think about here in the North, the battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor, but in reality, it was the battle between the Merrimack, the Monitor and the Virginia. However, this was not the first ironclad warship. That was the Glory, made in France in 1859. It was obsolete within 1 year after being made and rarely saw service. It was put out of business by the British ironclad, the HMS Warrior, which still exists today in England. You can go on it, it's a museum. The world continued to build monitors like the ones that the North made. It was designed by John Ericsson, one of the greatest engineers of all time. He's the man who invented the propeller and the swiveling turret. And the British continued to make monitors until World War I, and they were still using them in World War II. One of them still survived. It's called the M13, and you can see it at the museum in Portsmouth too, if you like that sort of thing. We had the first police officer killed in the line of duty here. The first law officer in America was killed in Albany, of all places. Darius Quimby was killed by a trespasser. The trespasser was caught and he was hung. But he was just a constable. He was unpaid and a volunteer in a makeshift police force. The first professional actual police officer was Ezekiel Hodson, and he caught two thieves breaking into a store near what's now Maverick Station in East Boston, and they shot him in the head. Thousands of people came to his funeral from all over America. It was a huge tragedy. His killers were never caught, unlike the killer of the trespasser who killed the constable. This little picture that you see on the left was a picture that was put in the newspaper to commemorate his passing. The newspaper was the Boston Spectacle, a paper that's long since gone. YMCA was invented in England, but it was brought to America in 1851 by Captain Thomas Sullivan. It turns out that Boston, for its size, had more brothels, taverns, and gambling dens per capita than any other place in America. It really was a pretty nasty place. And right around 1853, Ann Street in the North End was a 2-mile stretch that went from Faneuil Hall all the way to what is now the Coast Guard dock out at the end of the north end of Boston. There were over 1,700 bars, brothels, and gambling dens on that 2-mile strip. And the police would raid it constantly. They couldn't get rid of it. Finally, they changed the name to North Street. But this captain, Captain Thomas Sullivan, was worried about his sailors coming into Boston and being corrupted by all this stuff. So he brought in the YMCA and gave them a place where they could go and read and study, take classes. The YMCA started Northeastern University. They were the ones that introduced basketball to Boston. Basketball was invented in Springfield, another great Boston thing. And it's still, the same building is still on the same location on Huntington Ave, although people can't stay there anymore. You used to be able to rent rooms for like $20 a night, but not anymore. First public garden in America. This is one of our greatest jewels. The Boston Public Garden, made on filled land in 1859. This was the site of a great controversy. When they filled this land in, a merchant named David Sears, who was one of the richest and most powerful men in America, tried to force the city to seize the land and put mansions on it so that rich people could live on the gardens. However, the leaders of Boston, in a moment of wisdom, voted him down, and they kept the public gardens open to the whole public. The pond in the center has swan boats in it that were put there by the Piaget family, and they're still running those swan boats, the same family, since 1876. And the reasons why they're swans is because Piaget saw an opera in Boston of Lohengrin, and at one point the swan takes the ballerina across the lake, and so that's why he made the swan boats, and they're the same ones. This statue that you see of George Washington was made by Thomas Ball. It's considered the greatest statue in Boston and one of the greatest in America. One of the cool things about George Washington's statue is that he carries a sword in his right hand, but the sword is made out of plastic because it's been stolen so many times that the park department doesn't put the bronze sword back anymore. They just make it out of plastic so people can steal it. So I grew up near this rail yard here. This is in Reedville. And those little trains that you see on the right were there when I was a child. This picture is from 1977. This is the only fully gravity-employed railroad in the United States, and it's the last one in Boston, the last rail yard left in Boston. The next nearest one is in Framingham. It was started as a car repair shop for the Hartford Railroad in 1860, and Munson and Goss also used it to make their rail cars that they used to fill in the Back Bay. The main yard was closed in the 1970s, but the Walcott operation is still in main use, and the freight warehouses were converted to many things. First, they were a Stop and Shop warehouse. Then about 15 years ago, Warner Brothers bought them for a movie sound studio. There were many movies shot there. For example, Mystic River, parts of Mystic River were shot there. This is the last freight yard in Boston. This freight yard is built on the grounds of Camp Meigs, which was the biggest fort, Army fort in America, in New England at that time, and where the Black Regiment, the 54th Regiment, was trained before it went to fight during the Civil War. The cool thing about this is that all the cars are directed by gravity. They don't use engines. There's a downslope, and what happens is when the cars start rolling, a switchman looks at a sign on the car, and he throws a switch to direct the car to the right line of cars so that all the cars can be brought to the correct location without having to use a switching engine. The biggest of these yards in the entire world is in North Platte, North Dakota. And if you ever take a look at it on the internet, it's a pretty cool thing. First Arboretum, the Arnold Arboretum in Jamaica Plain was the first arboretum or tree park in America. They were big in Europe, and they started to move over here. It's about 400 acres. It was donated by a whaler named James Arnold and a businessman named Benjamin Bussey. Everybody remembers Arnold because of the Arnold Arboretum. Nobody remembers Benjamin Bussey. He got a bridge named after him called the Bussey Bridge, which was the scene of one of the greatest train disasters in America, where the bridge was built by the lowest bidder, a man who wasn't an engineer and had never built a bridge in his life. And after a little while, the train was going on. The first commuter rail in America was going from Dedham to Boston, crashed off the bridge and killed 100 or some odd people. So all that he's remembered for, even though he gave a lot of the land for the Arboretum, is this bridge that killed lots of people. So the best thing about the Arboretum, I think, is the Walk of the Lilacs, which is on Mother's Day every year. And thousands of people come, they bring their mothers and they walk around, and there are millions of lilacs. It's very beautiful and it smells great. Lilac is my favorite scent. Now, I think, as a woodworker, I think this is the greatest thing, right? Lots of cool tools came from Boston. This is the combination square made by L.J. Starrett in 1878. I defy any carpenter who does not own this tool. This tool is used worldwide. L.J. Starrett made a factory in Athol, Massachusetts. I've been there many times because there's a great waterfall there to go swimming. This is the last precision measurement maker in the United States. He employs thousands of people, and Starrett tools are reputed to be the best tools in the world. And another cool thing from Boston. All right, that's the end of cool things from Boston. I wanted to talk a little bit about things from Boston that we have lost over the years. Only a few slides. Boston is has burned down more than any city in the United States. There are many books about the things that have burned in Boston. And you would think that Boston would have a really good fire museum, but it doesn't. Boston has a crappy fire museum. It's actually one of the slides we're going to talk about later. It did have a good fire museum, but some firebugs burned the fire museum down in 1982. There were a whole bunch of people that decided that when Proposition 2.5 came in, that they were going to burn down so many buildings that Boston would have to hire lots and lots of firefighters. So they burned down, they set over 2,000 fires in like a 5-year period. Boston was the arson capital of the world. And so what happened was William Weld, who later became the governor, finally broke the arson ring in 1981. Over 200 people were indicted, and it turned out that the leader of the ring was the head of the state police arson unit. And it was consisted of all kinds of people, lawyers, landlords, developers, firebugs, and firemen. All these people were involved. They all had a vested interest in burning down their buildings, collecting the insurance, rebuilding, and so on and so forth. Really, Boston has an incredible fire history. There are a lot of books about it. There's a new one called Burn, Baby, Burn, which is a really good book about Boston's fire history. The Hancock Tower Observatory was closed after 9/11. It's never opened since. The property, what used to be at the top, was an observation deck where you could go 3/4 of the way around and see the city, the highest place in Boston where you could view the city. So developers used this as an excuse to take the observation deck away and make it into expensive and pricey offices. There was a contract at one time that tried to make this observation deck as part of the Emerald Necklace, but the contract was somehow lost after 9/11. Very suspicious to me. The Spinnaker Lounge was a spinning restaurant at the top of the Hyatt Regency on Memorial Drive. This was a great place to go. It was a massive restaurant. You would go up on the roof and it would turn round and round while you ate your dinner. It was really cool. It gave a really good view of the city. So it closed in 2006. The maintenance of the revolving table was too expensive. So now it's just a meeting room. Although they did have a big revival of it in 2014. They opened up the Spinnaker again, but they couldn't turn it on. The machinery no longer worked. So it was just like a reminiscent thing. So the Alexander Graham Bell Museum disappeared in 2006. Alexander Graham Bell is credited with inventing the telephone. He built the phone on what is now Cambridge Street. There's a little tiny monument there. I've talked about this in my other presentations. You can go and see where he did this. However, in 1922, they wanted to widen Cambridge Street, so they raised his house and his laboratory. But Mr. Wasson was hired to move the entire thing to the AT&T building, which you see in this picture, this Art Deco building. It was made into a museum on the first floor. It was a free museum. There was a massive mural called Men and Women at Work. And when AT&T sold the building to Verizon, the entire mess disappeared. No one knows where it is. I've been looking for it for more than 10 years. I've contacted everybody, the city, AT&T, Verizon, the Boston Preservation Alliance. Nobody knows where it is. The mural ended up in a private museum in Newport. Makes me mad. Really makes my blood boil. This is probably the greatest loss to Boston that could possibly be imagined. The Museum of World War II was the most extensive private World War II museum in the entire world. It was opened in 1999 in Natick in a warehouse. It was hidden and kept semi-secret. You had to make an appointment to go see it. They had every single thing from World War II that you could possibly imagine. They even had the original Versailles Treaty, which was signaled the surrender during World War I, and they had the original surrender document signed on the USS Missouri. Now, the first time I went there, you could actually flip through the pages of these documents and see the signatures of all the famous people who were there. But the second time I went, they were under glass because they were getting too much abuse. It was sold to a developer last October, and now it's gone. It is a huge, huge loss to Boston. One of the cool things about this museum was that every single thing in it you could pick up and play with. The guns, the bombs, the trucks, everything. So it really was a huge loss to Boston. So the Prudential closed this, the Prudential Observation Deck and Restaurant closed this past spring. They have said that they might reopen again. This is a view that used to be from the the Prudential Observation Deck. And now this was the last 360-degree view of Boston from that height. You can still get a 360-degree view from the Custom House Tower, but this was the highest place where you could do that. It's now gone. I think it's a huge loss to Boston. So we've lost a lot of cool and important restaurants. This is a very tiny list. Doyle's just closed this year. Doyle's was 150 years old. It was an American institution. Almost every movie that filmed in Boston filmed a scene in Doyle's. Big loss for Boston. Jacob Wirth was the second oldest restaurant in Boston and one of the oldest in America. They finally closed this past year. They had the longest bar in Boston and the largest number of beers being sold. It was a German restaurant that sold real German food. Big loss to Boston. The building is still there. Don't know what's going to happen to it. Durgan Park, which was the last original business in Faneuil Hall, from when Faneuil Hall started in 1825, closed a couple of years ago as well. This was just a pure case of greed. It was bought by a company in New York about 10 years ago. It was still profitable, just wasn't profitable enough, so they closed it. Amrines in South Boston, which had the first beer tap in America. It'll be demolished for condos. That closed just recently, very sad. Loch Ober, the last exclusively men's bar in America, was closed for good a few years ago. It actually changed hands in the 1990s, opened up to women, and served the best steaks. Politicians used to go there, it's gone. And the Cheers at the Faneuil Hall closed by the pandemic, they're gone. But the Cheers, which is at the Hampshire House next to the Public Gardens, is still open. So we had a lot of great department stores, over 130 actually. So this list is really pretty small. Jordan Marsh is gone. R.H. Stearns was the wealthy store, the Nordstroms of its day. Filene's, the inventor of the markdown sales, gone. Gilchrist's was one of the big three. This was like the cheap store, the Walmart of its time. Lechmere, which was a harness shop, closed in 1994. Grossman's, which was the largest lumber company in New England, closed after they declared bankruptcy. And Bradley's, well, they went out of business in 2001, which is too bad. These were all things that people knew. There were many other stores like Mammoth Mart and Mars and all kinds of other stores, but they're gone. Here are some famous publications from Boston. Scientific American, still published, the oldest continuously published magazine in America. Good Housekeeping, which is like a well-kept secret, is the most continuously successful and profitable magazine in U.S. history, started in 1885, still extremely popular. The Atlantic was started right here in Boston by a group of men, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and Longfellow in 1832. This is the Thought Leader magazine. It's one of the most prestigious magazines in America. The New England Journal of Medicine is the oldest continuously published medical journal in the world, probably the most prestigious since 1811. The Harvard Business Review, very prestigious. And Houghton Mifflin got its start here as Ticknor and Fields in 1842. If you ever have the time, you should read the story of Ticknor and Fields. It's absolutely amazing, all the things those people did. Now, I added the Old Farmer's Almanac in Yankee Magazine, even though they're in Durban, New Hampshire, because back in those days, Durban was part of Massachusetts. So that's the end of cool things in Boston. And now I'm going to try and switch to free things to do that I like. So if I was going to invite somebody to come visit me in Boston, the very first place I would think about taking them is the Charlestown Navy Yard. The Charlestown Navy Yard is a massive shipyard just outside of Boston, and it's the home of the USS Constitution, the oldest commissioned warship afloat. It's not the oldest commissioned warship. That is the HMS Victory in England, but the HMS Victory does not float. It's in a dry dock, permanent dry dock. The Constitution does float. They turn it around from time to time. It goes out and fires cannons at the castle on Castle Island. Then it turns around and comes back. This is also the home of the Cass and Young, which is the type of destroyer that was made here during World War II. Cass and Young was an amazing hero. He was blown off his ship, the Vesper, in Pearl Harbor. He swam back to the ship and he fought the Japanese, and he was given another ship to command. And during another battle, he was killed by a kamikaze. so they named the ship after him. Every now and then they turn this ship around. They don't do it anymore, but they used to have a party on it. I've been on it 4 or 5 times when it sailed, and it was really quite the cool thing. There is a cheap $3.50 water shuttle that goes from downtown Boston to come to the Navy Yard. The Tudor wharfs are here. This is where the foundation of ice shipping began worldwide. Frederick Tudor would collect ice in the winter, save it in his wharf here, and the building is still there. Then he would ship it down to the Caribbean, where he would trade it for fruit and bring the fruit back. The people, when they saw the ice down, so they couldn't believe it. They had never seen ice before in their lives. So it was an amazing thing. From here, you can walk to the Korean Memorial Park, which has a water park. It's a water fountain park, which is a great place to go when it's hot. There's also the Bunker Hill Monument, and you can easily walk to Codfish Park, Revere Park, and the North End from here. And one of the cool things they have is the last remaining rope walk, quarter-mile rope walk in America, which has recently been made into condominiums, and they have a museum for the rope making here. The rope walk was closed in 1972, but it was reopened again during the Ronald Reagan years because it was the only place in America where they could make the rope big enough to tie down the battleships that Ronald Reagan had reactivated. Free. This is the greatest thing in Boston, in my opinion, is the tour of the Boston Public Library. The Boston Public Library is the oldest circulating library in the US. It's also an art museum. They provide a free tour every single day, 2 or 3 times a day. The tour takes about 90 minutes. There's an open air atrium in the center with music every day, and there's a cafe. Obviously, all of the things that I'm talking about assume that COVID goes away, because if COVID doesn't go away, then a lot of these things you really can't do. The Navy Yard, for example, is closed right now. This library tour is the greatest thing in the world. There is so much stuff inside this library that you absolutely can't believe. This picture up on the right of the man in red is part of a 16-mural set that tells the story for the search for the Holy Grail. And those, the Lady of the Lake was written by Alfred Lord Tennyson in, I think, 1843. And it was the Harry Potter of its time. And it was so popular throughout the world that when this library was made in the 1870s, that they filled the waiting room with these giant murals to tell the whole story of Sir Galahad going to find the Holy Grail. It wasn't King Arthur. In this picture, this is the key picture, that's Joseph of Arimathea in the white, who is dead, leading Sir Galahad to the chair perilous. And if he's not pure and he sits in the chair, he dies. And to the right, you can barely see it. King Arthur is watching him. Now, Sir Galahad wears red because he's a virgin. And the only way you can be pure is if you're a virgin. So he sits in the chair and he lives, and they send him off to go get the Holy Grail, which he does get. And at the end, the Holy Grail is taken up to heaven. And the Holy Grail was made by John Singer Sargent. It's made out of gold, and it's stuck up on the wall in the last mural. It is well worth going to the library just to have the tour guide tell you the story about this these set of murals. It really is beautiful. One of the other cool things about this is that the lions on the public library in New York, Patience and Fortitude, are copies of the lions that were in the Boston Public Library first. Okay. Massachusetts State House offers a free tour every day. This is the seat of our state government. You can see the gold dome on top. It's 24-karat gold leaf. They leaf it again about every 10 years. At the very, very top of this tower, it looks like there's a pineapple. It's not a pineapple. It's a pine cone, because Massachusetts used to extend all the way up to the top of Maine. And Maine was the source of trees. And so one of the greatest exports and products of Massachusetts, which included Maine, was the pine cone. Now, that pine cone signifies the top of Beacon Hill, where there was a long tower. If there was ever going to be a problem, if the Portuguese attacked or if the Indians attacked, they would set that pine cone on fire and tell everybody that there was something going wrong in Boston. So that's what it symbolizes. So the tour here every day, it's free, takes about an hour. You can see all the cool things that are in Boston, all the corruption that's happened over the years, and all the cool things that have been stolen from the State House, including the original Massachusetts Compact. So it's well worth going to see this tour. This is one of my favorite things in Boston. I take everybody that comes to the city here. It's the Independence Wharf observation deck. It's on top of this building. This building was built on Griffin's Pier, which was where the Boston Tea Party was held. It's free. Anybody can go up there. Nobody knows it's there. It's really secret. You're on the roof. You can see all of Boston Harbor. And then if you run to the other side, you can see the Greenway. And since nobody's there, you can cop a little smooch with your loved one, and it's well worth it. I highly recommend this. This is part of the Emerald Necklace and the Harbor Walk. So by law, it always must be available to the public. Please go up there and take a look around. It is so amazing. And then when you go down, right across the street is James Hook Lobster, where you can get a $20 lobster roll and eat it al fresco or send lobsters Federal Express to your friends. This is a very interesting free thing. It's the Deer Island Sewage Treatment Plant Tour. You have to sign up 6 weeks in advance for this tour because you have to get an FBI criminal background check to go there because there are so many poisonous and explosive things there. Those little tanks that you see that look like eggs are filled with everybody's sewage from 43 communities around Boston. 350 million gallons a day. They take it in there. 95% of it is water. The rest is toilet paper and poo. They take out all the water. They save the poo. They send it down to Florida, and the people in Florida put it on the orange groves. The water is shipped out to sea, where it's dumped 9 miles out into sea. This is a free tour. It's extremely interesting, and it's well worth it if you have the time. The MAP Model Room is one of the greatest things in Boston. This is located in City Hall, and it's free. This is where they have a gigantic, and when I say gigantic, it's gigantic. It's a giant room where they built the whole city out of wood. And if they're going to put a new building in, they make different models of the building and they put it in place. And they'll see what the building is going to look like before they build it. And you can see how the whole city is laid out. Now, they give you a guided tour on Tuesdays, but if there's not developers in there, anybody can go anytime the City Hall is open, and it's free. The really cool thing about the guides is they'll tell you what's coming. They'll tell you the next stages of development that are coming along in Boston, and it's very, very interesting. I love the map room, and I have to tell you, it really smells great because of all the wood. The Boston Harbor Hotel Summer Series is one of my favoriteest things to do in Boston. Every single night of the week, except on weekends, they have free entertainment here, right on the wharf. They have different dance nights every night of the week, except for Friday. They have blues night, they have oldies night, they have Frank Sinatra night, they have jazz night, and swing night, and so on. And on Fridays, they have family movie days, and it's free. Now, they also have a restaurant with reserved tables, so if you want to eat an expensive meal while you watch music, or dance on the barge, or just enjoy yourself, this really is a great, great place to go. And you can see the water taxis there. For $12, you can take the water taxi almost anywhere in the harbor. Another cool place is the Esplanade. The Esplanade was started in 1910. There were many, many competing designs for this. When they dammed up the river in 1910, they decided to make this Esplanade a public park. It's now 18 miles long. It has all kinds of things like community boating, the Hatch Shell, and walking trails. The Hatch Shell was paid for by the wife of the ex-mayor of Boston, a man named Storrow, for whom Storrow Drive was named. And she said she would only give the money if there was no road ever allowed on the park. And so the city agreed, took her money, built the Hatch Shell, and then put in Storrow Drive. So that was pretty interesting. The Boston Pop started here in 1885. Arthur Fiedler started conducting here in 1929. The Boston Pops was the most successful orchestra in musical history. Have sold more than 85 million albums. Well, look, we're back to Mount Auburn Cemetery again, because as I said before, this is the first garden cemetery in America. And the reason that I like to go here is not because of the expensive tour, but because of the free Washington Tower, which you see in the top picture. That is the highest spot west of Boston, where you can climb up to this tower and have an unbelievable view of the city. It's absolutely free, and it's a great place to smooch your loved one because nobody goes there. It's really, really cool. I highly recommend this. I can't believe it's free. Walking around the cemetery is excellent, and there are lots of free meetup tours too, where people give guided tours. However, if you want to get the audio tour or take the guided tour, it's like $40. The Freedom Trail is one of the most famous things in Boston. I put the old State House here. The old State House will be in a future presentation. I got to tell you, spoiler alert, going to the old State House is a ripoff. It's not worth the money. However, it is someplace that you can go, but it is on the Freedom Trail. Right below that balcony is where the Boston Massacre happened. And on that balcony is where Queen Elizabeth came in 1976. And the city of Boston paid her $50,000 for the tea that we threw into the harbor. That was kind of a joke because the tea was worth $2 million back then, but $50,000 back then. So we kind of ripped off the Queen of England when she was here. At the top of the building, you can see on the left is the English lion, and on the right is the Scottish unicorn. Those are the symbols of England because the State House was the seat of government in America. This is a great spot on the Freedom Trail, and the reason that I put there is because the Freedom Trail is free, but it's a self-guided tour, except the first one every day at 8:30 a.m. is toured by a ranger who explains everything that you're seeing. If you're an early riser, this is a great tour to take. It's free and it sells out every day. You have to make a reservation, so you got to call them up. It takes about 3 hours to do. It's well worth it. Bunker Hill Monument. First major monument built in America on the site of the famous battle. This was made of Quincy granite, started in 1821, the same time as Faneuil Hall, by Josiah Quincy, who was probably the greatest and last honest politician in Boston. Josiah Quincy made Boston what it is today. He was an incredible man. Quincy Quarries was made to make the quarry, to quarry the granite for this monument. There are 289 or 294 steps. Believe me, it's quite a challenge getting up there. And at the top, there is a little cannon. It was one of John Stark's cannons from the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, of which I am a member. John Stark was the man who said, live free or die, which is on the license plates of New Hampshire. There are lots of attractions near this monument, and it's free. It's one of your parks. It's well worth it. I've talked about these two things before. The Arlington Street Church and the Church of the Covenant in the Back Bay, both of them have the largest collection of Tiffany glass in the entire world. Well worth going to see. It's free. They have other things that you can see. If you're really nice to the sexton, they'll actually let you go up to that tower at the top and look around. The Tiffany glass windows were the subject of an attack by right-wing demonstrators who didn't like the church's stance on pro-gay marriage in 1972. So they threw a cinder block through the Tiffany glass window, and as a result, the church had to put armor over the windows, which made it so you could no longer see them. They took the armor off in the last 5 years. So if you go into this church during a sunny day, it really is quite a surreal and intense experience. It's free. The Church of the Covenant, also in the Back Bay, has a priceless Tiffany lantern that was made for the Columbia exhibition and was bought by the church. It is a massive Tiffany glass lantern. That's worth seeing as well if you have the time. So here's a cool thing that I think is very unique is the MBTA Command Center. You can see the T started as a ferry service in 1693. It's the oldest transport system in the United States, and it's managed out of Post Office Square, down in a deep bomb-proof bunker where nobody can blow it up. And they use computers to manage all the subway trains. And every week or so, or every month or so, they will offer a free tour for maximum six people. You have to call up and make a special reservation. You have to go through a special security procedure to get in, show your license, and so on and so on. But it's a really cool tour to see how they make the trains work. And it's free. The BU Observatory is a couple of telescopes, giant telescopes on top of Boston University on Commonwealth Avenue that is open to the public on Thursdays on nights that there is visibility, and they allow anybody to come up and sit in the chair and look at the sky and see what they can see through the telescopes. Eventbrite is the ticket provider for these, even though it's free. And if you are not a member of Eventbrite, I highly recommend you going online and signing up. They control all the free and cool stuff that goes on in Boston, and they will send you an email every single day saying this free thing is happening, and that free thing is happening, and this is happening. It really is a great site, Eventbrite. Another one of my all-time favorite things is the Chestnut Hill Pumping Station, which is right next to Cleveland Circle train station on the Green Line. This was the pumping station that was used to move the water from that reservoir at Cleveland Circle into Boston. That water came from Lake Cochituate in Natick. So they used the same kinds of steam engines as the ones that were on the Titanic. They don't work anymore, of course, although they've talked about using compressed air to start them to get working again so they can show how they did work. The building was made into condominiums about 10 years ago, but they preserved this steam engine house that was used to pump water. It really is massive. It's free. They do ask for a donation. You don't have to give one, but it is well worth it. And even though the pumps don't work anymore, that reservoir is still an emergency water supply for Boston. The Massachusetts Archives is an interesting and boring place. So it's really free to go in there. It has the Commonwealth Museum inside, which is also free, which is really a museum for children. However, the cool thing about the Massachusetts Archives is the document room. In the document room, they have one of the original copies of the Declaration of Independence and all the major documents that have been preserved concerning the creation of Massachusetts. They also have the bill that Paul Revere gave to the Continental Congress for his aborted ride. He was the only one of the riders that charged the United States government for doing the ride, even though he didn't complete it. Paul Revere was something of a rogue. He was tried for desertion and cowardice in the Battle of Louisburg Square, which he lost. And you can see some of those documents there. Free! So just outside of Boston and Milton is the Blue Hills and Rock Climbing Park, which is really excellent. This is a surreal place. You have to go. This was the Quincy Quarries that we were talking about earlier. The quarries closed in 1965. They filled up with water. People would go swimming there. Sometimes they would drown. Criminals would put dead bodies and guns and cars down there. And so when they did the big dig, they decided to fill it in. So what was left behind were these massive craggy granite cliffs, which have been made into a gigantic rock climbing park. So there are also tours they give here that show you how they quarry the granite. And it is really interesting. And at the top of this hill is the Granite Lakes, which is a public golf course, which has the most excellent view of Boston from the south and the harbor. So you can sit at the bar, have a hamburger, drink a beer, watch people play golf, and have an excellent view of the city. Cannot recommend this highly enough. I do it all the time. It really is awesome. Community boating is the oldest boating organization in America. It's on the Charles River, part of the Esplanade, and you can sign up. What they do is, if you're a child in Boston, you can get a boat for $1 for the entire summer, and they'll teach you how to sail it. It's a 14-foot Mercury sailboat for $1. If you're an adult, it costs $283. But if you want to ride for free, you can go there and put your name on a list, and they'll send you out with a pilot. And they'll send you out for a trip of the Charles River Basin, which is lots of fun. When I was 15 and 16, I did this for 2 years. It was really one of the greatest experiences of my life, sailing on the Charles River. I mean, you're right next to all these other cool things like the free concerts and so on. Here's the crappy Boston Fire Museum. As I told you before, the Boston Fire Museum was burned down in 1982 by some firebugs. So what happened was they decided to try and make another fire museum in this old firehouse, which is on Congress Street in South Boston. This museum does not really have all that many artifacts because a lot of the artifacts burned down, but some of the artifacts they have are really cool. They have the first fire engine in Boston from 1793, which was like a child's wagon with a hand pump and a garden hose. In those days, the idea was not to put out the fire in the house. The idea was to save the people and the furniture and let the house burn down. So the people who run this are all volunteers. There's all kinds of cool things in there about how the role of the horse in pulling the fire wagon. Horses were used in Boston until 1938 to pull fire engines. The last one in New York was in 1922. The fire engine was invented in 1853. When the fire engine came to Boston in the 1870s, the firemen were so scared that it would put them out of work that they destroyed the fire engine. That happened in every city in America until they finally were able to get enough fire engines that the firemen would not destroy them. Another free thing is the ETHERDOME at the Mass General Hospital. So there was a quack named William Morton who forged his own medical credentials, and he would go from city to city and buy everything on credit, then skip out without paying, until he finally came to Boston and decided to become a real dentist. Then he got interested in working with ether. At the same time, Dr. Joseph Warren became the first head of medicine at Harvard, and he had been conned by another man named Wells that nitrous oxide was the greatest painkiller in the world. But during the operation using nitrous, the patient woke up and started screaming, and Joseph Warren said, "This is all humbug. There is no cure for pain." And so when William Morton told him that he was going to do an operation with ether, Joseph Warren told him he was a nutbag, but he came to watch the experiment, and it worked. And the patient who had a tooth removed woke up and said, "I didn't feel a thing." And Dr. Warren made the incredible world-changing statement, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The theater that you see is the exact same theater that was where he was operated on. That painting at the end shows them working on it. It is still used as a lecture hall. Those are the original chairs. I will tell you, they are absolutely miserably uncomfortable. I feel bad for any medical students that have to do a lecture in this hall. And right next door is the Dr. Joseph Warren Museum of Medical Oddities. Because what happened is when people died that had all kinds of strange deformities, he would boil their bodies in acid and keep all the bones and store them in a glass case. So now you can see all these Siamese twins and other crazy things that he stored after people died. A major statue exists in the Boston Public Garden commemorating the invention of ether. It does not give credit to Dr. Morton because so many people claim to have invented ether or use it for surgery at the same time that they decided to just make a monument to the relief of pain. So on the roof of the Mass General Hospital also is the Peace Garden. This is a Japanese chapel where people who are critically ill and are dying can go to find peace, but they also will allow you to go up there. It has an incredible view of the Charles River and of Boston on the top. You can say a little prayer and do a little reflection and look out on the expansive city. It's free. This is one of the coolest things in Boston. This is the Museum of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery. This is the oldest military organization in America and the third oldest in the world. So it has many famous people who are members. And one of the cool things that are in here, these famous people donate all their famous military artifacts. It is hidden on the top floor of the Faneuil Hall. You wouldn't even know it's there. It's very hard to get into because the volunteers are now very old. And so it's catch as catch can when you get up there. One of the things that are there is this cannon. This cannon was made in 1678 in Holland. It was captured in a battle by the British, who used it against the Americans, where it was captured at the Battle of Saratoga. The Americans then used it during the Civil War, where it was captured by the Confederates. And then during the Battle of Gettysburg, it was captured by a Massachusetts regiment and stored in Boston, where in 1919, it was used to fire grape shot on strikers, on police strikers during the 1919 police strike. So a cannon that was made in 1678 was still being used in 1919. Incredible story. So Arnold Arboretum in World's End, we've talked a little bit about this already. Designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, is part of the Emerald Necklace. It's open to the public. Castle Island, again, this is the oldest fort. And the reason that it's here is because it's free. They have tours on Sundays. You can go in and watch the tours. There's also a monument to William B. McKay, who invented the clipper ship and built a large fleet of clipper ships in East Boston. This fort is where the Constitution comes and fires its guns every 4th of July. And then the Royal Irish Artillery come there and fire their cannons back at the Constitution. Big party on the 4th of July. It's free. It's worth going there anytime. The Lawnette D is a brand new park that was opened up right next to the convention center on D Street. This is a playground for adults. They serve all kinds of booze. They have swings and cornhole and all kinds of games. It's open every day and it's free. It's a nice place to go in the city. There really aren't that many places in South Boston for people to go and party. And you can rent this place out as well. This is one of the greatest things in America. It's the Spirit of 76 painting. This is in Marblehead in the town hall. The painting is massive. It's really like 10 by 10. Archibald McNeil Willard started out making this as a gag. That's his father in the middle. His father is the one banging the drum. He actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and he was the model for the painting. When he displayed this painting, it became so popular that immediately had to make copies and postcards, which he sent out. A copy that he made of it himself, the second biggest copy, is in the U.S. Navy, is in the U.S. State House in Washington. Faneuil Hall, I'm not going to belabor this. Anybody can walk around this tourist trap. There's lots of things to see and do here. Not to mention the little buskers that, like for $1, will do a high wire act or whatever. The Christmas tree lighting here every year is something to see. It's the biggest Christmas tree in America, donated to Boston by Halifax, Nova Scotia, for our response to the biggest non-nuclear explosion in history that happened in 1917 when an ammunition ship blew up in Halifax and destroyed the entire city in the middle of a blizzard, and Massachusetts people immediately sent a medical train up to relieve them. The Secret Garden is in Kendall Squares on top of a parking garage. Nobody knows it's there. Has beautiful views of the city, and they also have a food cart. It is a quiet and relaxing place to go, and it's free. Another cool thing to see are the Paul Revere Park and the Charles River Locks. If you are in Boston and you like the water, you can walk to Boston from the north, from Charlestown, through the Paul Revere Park, and you can stop at the locks and watch the ships be pumped in and out of Boston through these locks. It's actually pretty interesting. At the bottom is the Charles River Bridge. That crabby little bridge, you wouldn't believe it, but was at one time the longest bridge in the entire world, is now being torn down and being replaced, thank God. Old City Hall, if you have somebody who can take you around and show you what's going on, Old City Hall has more going on in it than you could possibly shake a stick at. Old City Hall is a Second Empire design. Blair House in Washington, D.C., which is where the vice president lives, was a direct copy of this building. That statue of Ben Franklin was the first statue cast in America. The first school in America was on this site. King's Chapel is right there. They have tours. It's excellent. The very first fire alarm in America is on one corner of this, and Pie Alley is next door. The Old Corner bookstore is here. There is so much history in this one block that is well worth going to see, and it's free. Dorchester Heights is kind of a ripoff. It's not worth going, in my worthless opinion. I put it here because this is the site where Washington was able to scare away the British, got them to leave Boston because the Americans threw up a fort overnight, absolutely one night, which the British said would take 6 months to build. There was a major naval engagement between the British and the Americans. 40,000 rounds were shot into this hill. And when it was over, they built this monument here to Washington's great victory. That is the presentation. I think I ran 10 minutes longer than I expected, and I apologize for that, and I hope you don't hold it against me. But thank you for attending. I hope somebody's still here and not everybody left. But I appreciate your patience and your attention. The next presentation, which we'll do sometime soon, part 5, will be cheap things to do in Boston.
Thank you.
Did anyone have any questions for Jay? You can type it in the chat now. Lots of people are saying thank you, Jay.
Thank you. I can't see that stuff, so.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. What's your very favorite site, Jay?
in all of Boston,
Yep.
I would say the favorite thing the favorite thing that I would do for free is that observation deck at Griffin's Wharf, Independence Wharf, because it is beautiful, it's easy, it's free, it's right next to James Hook, it's right in the middle of the city. It really is, it's a great thing to do. Also, Boston Public Library tour. I've done it many times. I do it over and over again because it is so marvelous.
I'm excited about going on the Mount Auburn self-guided tour of the cemetery, I mean. That's
Yeah, you'll really like that. There's some pretty amazing stuff there. Don't forget to go up the tower. I'll be very disappointed if you don't.
I'll report back. That was really excellent, Jay. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we'll talk about scheduling your next presentation.
Okay, thanks. Bye,
Okay.
buddy.
All right. Good night, everyone.